Welcome back, viewers, for another video of making decisions. This one's going to be over using SQL steps in decisions in both the Flow Designer, in Create Data Types and Integration, and in Reporting. So the first one's going to be using the raw SQL step. This is going to be in a normal flow that you can create in a designer project folder, and we're going to use the step called raw SQL. Type that in the search bar, and you're going to get this step. This is a step that allows designer users to write a query to perform a function on an external database, on the current connection, that is the decisions installed database, or on any custom connection string that the user can define. How this step works is it has two areas that you want to be aware of. The main two areas are the output settings and then the inputs for the command. The output settings, if you have a query that runs that is supposed to return data to the user, you will want to check this box. This will open the dialog to allow a user to decide how they want that SQL data to be returned to them. In this case, you can select data type, and it could be any user defined or any default decisions type. My example for today will be the accounts table. So I'll want to output the accounts type since that's the table I'll be querying from. But let's say if I didn't want to do that, I can do data rows, or I can have it output a CSV or Excel file with the data that I queried. For the sake of example, I'm going to leave it on select type, and I'm going to select the account type. All I need to do right now, after I've selected the return type option, now I just need to type in the query that I want to run. This could be set from a dynamic value, or you can set it up as a constant value. I'm going to do it as a constant value, so I'm just going to do select asterisk from dbo.entity underscore account. And this is a simple query statement that is just going to query the accounts table and return all the accounts that I have in my current system. When I debug this, you'll notice that it went down the done path. We can look at the inputs and outputs of this. You see the input is that query command that I sent. And then as you can see in the results, you see all the different accounts and their IDs associated in my system. The system account, the guest account. We have the administrator account. So this is another way to return data in decisions by writing your own query. Now, the next way that we'll talk about is one that is considered the best practice in decisions because it is more scalable. Another way that you can define a query that you want to run, whether for your current connection or external connection, is through Create Data Types and Integrations. In Create Data Types and Integrations, there is this section called Database Integrations. And in Database Integrations, you can add a procedure, a table, a view, a relationship, or the one that we're going to do is a query. When I left click and select Add Query, I get similar prompts like the raw SQL steps in regards to what is the table that I'll be querying. In this case, I want the local connection. And then now I have this menu here where I can give the query a name and also define what that query will do. Be aware when you name your query, you want to make sure that you do not use spaces. Because if you do, you'll have an error that says, hey, your query name cannot contain spaces. So I'm going to call this custom fetch email fetch account query. And now I can define the same query that I defined on the raw SQL step. And notice that when I hit the run query to test to make sure it works, I see that I have the request completed and it returned all the accounts. Now, but the cool thing about this one is I can define variables. So let's say I only want to return an account that has an email address that matches a criteria that the designer user will determine when they're using the step in a flow. How I do that is I'm just going to add the where clause, email underscore address, equals, and then I'm going to use the variable sign, which is the @ sign, and say @email. Now, this query is designed to say, hey, I want to run and give the designer user a variable input to this flow step so that they can determine what email account they want to be retrieved. So let's go ahead and click OK on this. Decisions will compile that, and it will appear as an entity within the decisions environment. My code compiled. Now I can go back into my flow and test this step. I'm going to remove the raw SQL step. And now there's two ways you can find this. You can search for your custom created step. So I think it was a custom fetch something. Custom fetch account right here, and I can drag it over. Or if you want to know where it lives in the actual tree here, it's going to be an integration, database, local connection, because that's where I defined it. And then you'll see my custom fetch account query. Now, let's connect this up. When I click on this step, you'll notice that I have a limit count, which I'll just set to 1. I mean, not 1, 10. And then I have an email input. This is the variable that I defined when I created this query. So I'm going to set this as a constant, and I'm going to say I want it to fetch the account admin@decisions.com. So now, when I run this query, I can define the output type, which by default, it just creates its own kind of query definition type to output. I could easily change this to the accounts type if I want, or I can change it to data rows or CSV file. I'm going to leave it the default right now, and I'm going to debug so we can see if that query returned the expected result. So I debug this, I start the debugging, went down the done path, so we see that it executed correctly, but that doesn't mean it returned a result. So let's review the inputs and outputs, and the input is the admin@decisions.com account, the limit count is 10, and when we look at the query, it returned the actual account right here. So this query should have one item, as expected, returned all 74 properties of this account. So those are the two ways that you can run queries and decisions. This one is the best practice way because it's more dynamic. If I need to change or add to this query, I can easily go back into the query definition here, edit this query, and add any more parameters if I so choose. The final way that we'll talk about is running decisions reports from a query. So I'm going to open up this one, and here you'll see that I already have this configured, and I'm going to remove this configuration so that we can see how this is set up. But to create a report that displays the data via a raw SQL step or via SQL, you want to add a data source, and it's just called raw, and you just want to select raw data source. Now in this raw data source, as you can see all the way to the right of my screen, you can define the different connections, whether you want to use the current connection, whether you want to use an external database connection, and then the query that you want to execute, and then also the fields you want it to return. I'm going to use an external database because I have one created for this specific example. So I'm going to use the address master data. And now what I want to do is I'm just going to run a query that says, hey, select asterisk from dbo.address data, because that's the name of the database. Alrighty. Now, in order for this thing to run, I need to tell decisions what are the fields that I want to be displayed on this report. Because notice when I click on the data fields here, there's nothing. So what I need to do is I need to go back to this data source. I need to add the fields. Now, this is case sensitive. You need to make sure that the field name that you type here is the exact casing and the exact, matches exactly to the database column of your external database integrated table. So keep that in mind. So the field I'm going to grab here is going to be the account code. It is a string, so I'm going to leave it as that. And then the next field I'm going to grab is the first name. And I'm going to click OK. Now, since I've defined these things here, I can now click to add these columns because they're defined in the return fields. So I'm going to select this one and select this one. And notice I have my account code and the first name displayed. And I'm using a query to display all these pieces of information from my decisions external integrated database table address master data. So that is using SQL in Decisions. We've talked about how to run raw SQL from flows with two types of steps, the raw SQL step or using a custom query definition where we can edit the query and create flow variables to allow designer users to add them in. And then we also created a report where when I run it, I can see the data from an external database integration that's being sourced from a query. That's the video for today. Please like and comment and subscribe. And if you have any suggestions on things you want to learn more about in Decisions, please suggest them. You can email makingdecisions@gmail.com or pop it in the comment section below. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.